Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Mack. I'm the Vice President for Marketing at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program with Menachem Z. Rosensaft and Ellen Bachner-Greenberg. As many of you know, Menachem is a prominent member of the second generation and a leading voice in the global community of those committed to Holocaust remembrance and education. His long list of accomplishments includes being a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, serving as General Counsel and Associate Executive Vice President of the World Jewish Congress, founding the International Network of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, and teaching about the law of genocide at the law schools of Columbia and Cornell Universities. Menachem, we thank you for being with us today to discuss your life's work.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Menachem is in conversation this evening with Ellen Bachner-Greenberg, another second generation leader and the co-founder of Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, along with Eva Fogelman. Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, which is co-presenting this evening's discussion, is a New York-based group with members who hail from all over the USA, Europe, and Israel. It is a place for children of survivors to connect with each other, to share thoughts, feelings, and memories, and to learn and teach about the legacy of the Holocaust. Ellen, thank you for your partnership. Everyone in attendance should feel free to share questions in the Zoom QA box throughout Menachem and Ellen's conversation, and they'll get to as many as they can towards the end of the hour. Without further ado, welcome Ellen and Menachem. Feel free to get started.
Great. First of all, Josh and the museum, thank you very much. Both Eva and I appreciate all that you do and your partnership with us and the program tonight. Absolutely. So Menachem, great to see you again. And let's start off with talking about your parents and their past. I know both of your parents, Hadassah and Joseph, survived both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. So why don't you tell us a little bit about their story?
Well, let me start with my mother. My mother was a dentist. She had studied medicine in France before the war and became a dental surgeon, returned to her hometown of Sosnowiec in Poland, married, had a child. In August of 1943, my mother, her parents, her first husband, her 5.5-year-old son, and her sister arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. All but my mother and her sister were sent directly to the gas chambers. My mother, because she was a dentist and was assigned to work in the infirmary in Birkenau in the women's camp, and while there, according to women who were there, not my mother, who didn't speak about it much, she saved the lives of countless women by performing rudimentary surgeries, getting them out, even still with high fevers, from the infirmary ahead of selections by SS doctors, and otherwise saving many lives.
That I just want to say that wasn't the only heroic thing that she did, right? She did a wonderful thing for these children. So I think I'd like to hear about that.
In November of 1944, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she and a group of other women inmates kept 149 Jewish children alive in what was known as a Kinderheim, a children's home, in Bergen-Belsen, despite a brutal cold winter and a raging typhus epidemic. So by the time of liberation, my mother had acquired a reputation of being one of the heroines in terms of those that she came in contact with. My father, meanwhile, was deported to Auschwitz several times from his hometown of Będzin, also in southern Poland, escaped several times, once from a train on its way to Auschwitz by diving out of the window into the Vistula River and getting shot at and having 3 bullets hit him, 1 grazing his forehead, 1 his arm, and a 3rd remained in his leg until he died. A 2nd time, he escaped from a labor camp to which he had been assigned and was in hiding for several weeks with a friend of his, was recaptured, sent back to Auschwitz, where he spent over 6 months in the death block, in the notorious Block 11, and then was sent from there in November of 44 to a subcamp of Buchenwald, Langensalza, from there to Dora Mittelbau, which was the camp where the V2 rockets were constructed under the direction of that later to be great American hero, Werner von Braun, and then arrived in Bergen-Belsen about 10 days or so before the liberation. And after the war, after the liberation, my mother was asked by the British to head a team of few doctors and other nurses, very few of them were trained nurses, to work alongside the British to try and save as many of the survivors as possible. In the 2 months following the liberation, 14,000 more Jews died of illness and malnutrition. My father, meanwhile, emerged right after the liberation as the central leading figure among the Jewish displaced persons, as they were then called, in Bergen-Belsen, in the displaced person camp. With Bergen-Belsen, the survivors were moved from the concentration camp to a German military base about 1 kilometer away, which became the largest displaced persons camp in Germany. And my father headed both the Jewish committee that administered the DP camp and the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the British zone of Germany from 1945, right after the liberation, until 1950-51, when the DP camp was closed down.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here before we get too far away. Menachem, in addition to all the many things he does, in his spare time, he writes poems. And there's a poetry book that was just released last month. And so Menachem, you wrote a poem entitled Psalm 13 at Auschwitz. So short poem, if you'd like to read that for us.
Well, yes, but let me put it a little bit in context, because we are all familiar with Psalm 23. It's often recited at funerals. It talks about the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me through green pastures and still waters, and sets a table in front of my enemies, anointed my head with oil, and I shall not fear, because I will be in Adonai's house forever. Well, how does one reconcile that with Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, the horrors of the Shoah? And so my response, my reaction is this poem. A psalm to the emptiness. No shepherd, only foes. No festive table, only bitter soup, moldy bread. No green pastures, no still waters, only blood-drenched, rat-infested mud. He is always hungry, she is always cold. Their heads anointed by blows, shadows walking through the valley of death. Adonai's fog-wrapped house forever.
Wow, Thank you. That is certainly a contrast to the soothing Psalm 23 that's often recited at deathbeds. So the war ends, there's liberation, and your parents are living in Bergen-Belsen DP camp, where you were born.
Correct.
Many of us are born children of survivors. We're born in the shadows of the Holocaust. You were born at the place of the Holocaust. Now, I believe you only lived there for a couple of years, and you were young, and then you went on to Switzerland and came to the U.S. at about 10 years old. So
Correct.
in what ways do you may not remember much of Bergen-Belsen, but maybe some of it stays with you? And how do you think that shaped you, and also coming to the U.S. as a refugee?
Well, those are two separate questions. On the one side, I have no memories of Bergen-Belsen whatsoever as a child. The only thing I know is what I was told by my parents. And in fact, I knew about the DP camp long before I knew about the horrors that preceded it. And what you have to remember about the DP camp, Bergen-Belsen in particular, but others, is that they were cocoons where the survivors were able to return to life. Yeah. And in the DP camp, they recreate the survivors in Bergen-Belsen under my father's leadership, recreated the world that they had known before the war to the best of their abilities. So Bergen-Belsen, for instance, had its complement of schools, high school, yeshivas, a newspaper, 2 theater companies, sports clubs, political organizations, from Zionist to Bundist. It had publications. And so the DP camps actually, for many of the survivors, were a period of quite positive transition back to life, especially because they were surrounded, having lost most of their families, they were surrounded by others to whom they did not have to explain themselves. Right. If they had nightmares, the next person understood what the nightmares were from. And so to that extent, Bergen-Belsen was, for me at least, in retrospect, a very positive part of my heritage, and it made it easier for me to reconcile with the horrors that preceded it, because I knew sort of intuitively that there was an aftermath. It didn't end with Auschwitz. It didn't end there. There was a period that followed. The second part, look, coming to the United States at the age of 10, it was less as a refugee than as an immigrant. And we were quite well established here fairly quickly. My father had quite a number of friends, both survivors and others from the Jewish political world. And what I remember, and Ellen, you probably remember it as well, is that for most of that period, the Holocaust wasn't spoken about.
Absolutely.
When we grew up, I mean, it's not like today when you learn about it, you read about it, it's part of the discussion. The only people who talked about the Holocaust at all were a few survivors, and the only ones who were really interested in listening were other survivors or those of their kids who were interested. So that to a large extent, it's not that the survivors were necessarily silent about their experiences, it's that they were not at that period in time encouraged to speak.
Right.
And that's also true of the American Jewish community and of the Israeli community. They didn't want to hear about it. It was like, it was not part of anything that they wanted to know, maybe out of a sense of guilt, maybe a degree of condescension to the survivors, as how could you allow yourself to be led and so forth.
Yeah, I'm going to just, I mean, you hit on something that I really can relate to. I did not grow up amongst other survivors. We were basically the only survivors in the area, and all of my parents' friends were American born. And I distinctly remember my parents had friends over for a dinner party, and it was not surprising that the conversation turned to the Holocaust. My father talked about the Holocaust. And then I'm upstairs and I hear the American-born friends asking, well, why didn't you leave? Not knowing that nobody would take them. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you, all these kinds of questions without any understanding. So it was really not spoken about. And in this case, when it was rather insulting. And then I remember this distinct mark, like at the end of the 1970s. I know that my father was involved with, Elie Wiesel and Ben Mead in gathering the Warsaw Ghetto WAGRO, right, and starting the commemorations and banding together. And at the same time, there was a group of children, children of survivors who band together, including you and Helen Epstein and Eva Fogelman, who were recent guests of ours here. And all of a sudden there were these groups and camaraderie about talking about the Holocaust. And so when you started these discussions and these groups, what did you set out to do? What was the goal?
Actually, I came to it a couple of years later than others,
right?
Because at that point I was studying. I was in a PhD program at Columbia in Modern European History. Then I moved to law school, and I was doing some writing about the Holocaust and such, but not that deeply involved with the second generation movement until a conference took place in 1979, which was a conference on an international conference on children of Holocaust survivors. It was and the title was rather indicative. The second day was fine, because the second day was commemorative with, I think, Michael Berenbaum participating, and of course, Eva and Helen and others. And that was more about children of survivors talking. But the first day was psychologist after psychiatrist, after mental health specialist, after social worker, basically giving learned papers about what was wrong with us and why we were traumatized and what was the problem. And by the way, they were perfectly honest about their work, but it was a little bit problematic, because the best comparison I can give is, it's like somebody taking a sample group of Alcoholics Anonymous and then taking that as indicative of the drinking pattern of the population as a whole. These psychiatrists and psychologists were reacting to those children of survivors who had come to them for help, which is fine. But what it ignored was a vast body of others. And at that point, I and a few of my friends who were at that conference said, you know what? We don't recognize ourselves in this depiction. And if people are going to be talking about us, we want to be in charge of the dialogue. We want to control it. And we have other issues, political, social, cultural, which are our priorities. And we don't want to spend our time just sitting around talking to ourselves about ourselves.
Right.
And Eva was a key part of that development that merged in 1981 into the first world gathering of Holocaust survivors in Jerusalem.
Right.
And that led to the founding of the international network.
you know, it originally started off as a way for children of survivors to share their unique and similar stories with one another. And now I see all these years later that children of survivors are getting involved with Holocaust remembrance and education, taking on the responsibility of telling their father's stories and their parents' stories. And I just want to read something from, in 1981, these are remarks made by Ben Mead at the 38th commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's a plea. Holocaust survivors always wanted their stories told and the world to remember. So these are part of his remarks. Since our liberation, we have tried to teach the world, to get it to listen. The uniforms, the photographs, the ruins of the death camps, the numbers tattooed on our forearms, horrible as they are, offer only a glimpse of the true horrors of those terrible times. We have tried to show them to the world sometimes. Witnesses are dying, and with them the memories, the names and faces of their families, gone before their legacy can be truly transmitted to the next generation. Perhaps now we can still tell humanity never to forgive, never to forget, and never to let such destruction happen again. So those are Ben Mead's words on behalf of the survivors and their plea. So 40 years later, how do you think we did?
Depend on who we is. Look, the international community has demonstrated that it really hasn't learned a hell of a lot from the Holocaust.
Right.
The expectation after 1945 was not only that anti-Semitism was dead and that no one would ever want to be identified with it again because of the association with the Nazis, something we know now is not true, and there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism that is frightening. But also, no one thought that a genocide would be allowed to happen again. Well, you had Rwanda, you had Bosnia, Srebrenica, you had the Yazidis, you had Darfur, you have the Rohingya today in Myanmar. In other words, the international community has demonstrated that it is not about to put its neck on the line to stop genocide, to stop crimes against humanity. And I have to say that the second generation somewhat disproportionately is involved in social action, in efforts to prevent the Holocaust, engage in not just Holocaust remembrance, but genocide commemoration on a broader scale. And I think it's to their credit, to our credit. But the other part of it is, what you mentioned, it is now our obligation to continue our parents' work, not because we have a monopoly on Holocaust memory. We don't. It belongs to the Jewish people and society as a whole. However, while we do not have any of the privileges of survivors, because we were not survivors, we did not suffer.
We are witnesses to the witness.
We are witnesses to the witnesses, that's correct. And we have the obligation to take our parents' memories and carry them into the future. And let me give you a just very quick example. My mother died in October 1997, shortly after, a couple of hours after the Rosh Hashanah that year. My daughter, our daughter, who was Jody, who was at that point a sophomore in college, was very close to my mother and had spent many, many hours with her. She was always the babysitter of choice. And about 6 months later, I was in Poland. I was working there for a foundation at the time. So I took her to Poland for the first time. We were in Warsaw, then we went to Krakow, then we went to Auschwitz I, which I showed her around, and then we went to Birkenau. And it was a gray, dismal day, drizzling, a perfect day for the atmosphere of Birkenau.
It's only supposed to be like that.
Right.
It's never
Exactly.
supposed to be sunny there.
Right. And we were walking together in silence past the barracks. And at one point, Jody says to me, you know, it's exactly the way Dasa, which is what she called my mother Hadassah, it's exactly the way Dasa described it. And then I realized that a transfer of memory had taken place. My daughter, born decades after the Holocaust, recognized the barracks of Birkenau through the memories that she had heard and absorbed from my mother. And it is now part of her consciousness that she will pass on to her children. And I think that's part of our obligation.
And you know, perhaps that obligation doesn't have to be limited to just descendants or even to just Jewish people. When I spoke recently at a school through Zoom in Florida about my father's story, and I knew that 80% of them were immigrants, their parents had no education. And I tried to focus on something that they could hold on to, that my father came here, didn't speak English, went to night school, got a GED, to try and give them hope. And telling the story, a witness to witness to witness, maybe it's not just our responsibility, maybe it's everybody's responsibility to hold on to and tell the story.
Oh, absolutely. But the point is that we have an obligation,
yes,
which is separate and apart, because we have a kind of intuitive relationship with the topic that is not learned from books and is not learned from from listening to a lecture.
Right.
And by the way, you're absolutely right. It has a huge impact. A daughter of survivors is the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Museum in Johannesburg. And after the Rwanda genocide, she went to Rwanda and was comforting and talking to the survivors. And it was the first time that they, of course, learned that there had been something such as the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And it was eye-opening for them to realize that on a continent far away, decades earlier, whites had done to other whites what the Hutus had done to the Tutsis.
Right.
And in a way, as my friend tells it, it gave them not comfort, but a sense of not being all that alone in the world. This wasn't something that had happened only to them.
Right. You know, historically, when survivors got up and told their stories, and books were written, and it was about the horrors, everything that went wrong. And that's important to know. It's important to know the history to try and understand what happened. I also see a shift here where stories of survivors are about resilience, about strength in their lives, how they survived and how they went on afterwards. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, to go back to a comment that you made with the people asking rather insensitive and ignorant question, why didn't you fight back? Well, I maintain that every single Jew who helped another Jew, who was teaching a child in a ghetto, despite and taught them to read, who in the camp was human to someone else, who shared some food, who remained human, who told a joke in a barrack at night, or sang a song, or just comforted one another. That was resistance. That was fighting back.
I'll take it one step further. When you have, when you live in an altered universe where the goal is to kill you, anybody who wanted to live, even for a day, wanting to live, was fighting back.
That's correct. And that's absolutely correct. So that, and the other part is there was a tendency among some people, there still is, to view the survivors through the lens of barbed wire at liberation and concentration camp uniform,
right?
That's staring out into the distance. And what they don't understand is they had all of the victims and the survivors had a life before the Holocaust.
Correct.
And they rebuilt a life for themselves after. And they have to be viewed, and we as their children and grandchildren have to be viewed in that overall context. Our parents' lives and their activities and their values are far more a part of us than the torture to which Germans and others subjected them.
Absolutely. And that brings me to something else. It's so important to honor survivors and recognize their strength and determination. And both you and I are on the advisory committee for Holocaust Survivor Day, which is coming up on June 24th. And, it's a day to honor them. There's so many days of mourning where you say Kaddish and you talk about the victims. This is talking about their strength, and the museum and also descendants of survivors, Holocaust survivors, my group and Eva's group are also participating in that, and we'll send more information out as it gets closer on ways to get involved, and to celebrate the survivors, which they enjoy they deserve the covet.
Absolutely, but it's also, this reminds me of something interesting. For the survivors of Bergen-Belsen, and they did not yes, Yom HaShoah, once it became instituted, was important. But as my father at one point said, for him, every day is Yom HaShoah. For the survivors, every day of the week, they can find someone who died. However, what they celebrated every year, and some of the children of survivors from the Belsen DP camp still do today, is they celebrated April 15th, which was the day of their liberation.
The second birth, and a day which for them had the positive connotation. It was a day when things started to go right, when when there was at least when hope became moved from being an illusion to being something realistic. When you all of a sudden had soldiers who were walking around, instead of beating and shooting and killing, were saying, you are free, and sharing food and giving words of comfort, and even, British soldiers going up to them and saying in broken Yiddish, Ich bin a Yid. And all of a sudden they saw the world in a different context. And that is very important to remember. Right, absolutely. So here we are in 2021, and anti-Semitism is in full force. Obviously the survivors wanted to make sure there was never any tragedies in the Holocaust again. But do you think that they expected anti-Semitism to be so alive and well and living in 2021?
I don't think so. I don't think any of us did, but I mean, and it, by the way, was naive to expect otherwise, because let's remember, the old Nazis did not just disappear in 1945. They just went, they didn't even go underground. They just sort of put their ideology and their anti-Semitism, their hatred for Jews on the back burner. They couldn't talk about it publicly, so they talked about it probably at home to their children or to their friends. And the same thing in other countries. Look, anti-Semitism wasn't a prerogative of Germans. It was in every country, whether it was France, whether it was Poland, whether it was Hungary. And it is no disrespect to those Poles and Frenchmen, French nationals, and others who rescued Jews and helped Jews to recognize that they were anti-Semites. There were those who, if they didn't actively participate, didn't particularly have a problem with Jews being removed from their midst.
Right.
Well, we are now 70 plus years later, 76 years later, and the old taboos have gone, and the anti-Semitic tropes come back out. I mean, it was during the recent Israel-Hamas conflict, what was truly frightening, and my organization, the World Jewish Congress, issued a report on it, were the social media postings, which were replete with such things as Hitler was right, all Jews should have been gassed. And all of a sudden, you have the, this was a particular problem on Twitter. I mean, to their credit, Facebook and Instagram tried to remove them as quickly as they showed up. But on Twitter, these things were around for days. And you know, if that's the language and that's becoming the legitimate discourse, it really it's really frightening. I mean, you know, there's a difference, by the way, just quickly, there's a huge difference between anyone having a political demonstration in support of Palestinians outside of an embassy. You can agree, you can disagree, that's legitimate political speech. But when you take that same demonstration and you hold it outside of a synagogue, or you hold it outside of a Jewish center, and you start attacking Jews as Jews, that's anti-Semitism on steroids.
Right. And it's almost like a perfect storm. You had all these pockets and things were swelling up for a couple years, and it's frightening. It's
absolutely
frightening.
And by the way, what we also have to sort of remember, that yes, there's anti-Semitism, but it's not in a vacuum. You know, you have those who accuse the Jews of being responsible for COVID-19. And then you have those who accuse everyone of Asian background to be responsible for COVID-19. And then you have everyone attacking every possible immigrant or every possible refugee. I mean, we are getting to a sense of, to an atmosphere of xenophobia in which anti-Semitism is a cornerstone.
It's really frightening because it has nothing to do, whether it's against the Jews or any of these other groups. It has nothing to do, it's not based in any sort of truth. It's
correct.
Based on rhetoric that just keeps getting repeated and repeated. And if you repeat something often enough, it could become true. So it's very hard to combat and fight something that has no validity.
Well, that's true. And the other thing that we really have to remember is that the shall we say, the primitive mindset is very comfortable with a scapegoat.
Absolutely.
Traditionally, the scapegoat, to have the scapegoat be the outsider, the one who is different. In Europe for centuries, it was the Jew, responsible for the Black Plague, responsible for capitalism, responsible for socialism, responsible for everything that went wrong. Today, we are in company with other minorities. And, let's put it this way, white supremacists don't just dislike people of color, they also dislike Jews and they dislike other groups. And that's just the reality. They're looking for scapegoats in order to justify their own often hate-filled ideologies.
Right. So let me turn and weave in some of the questions from the chats here. And thank you, Josh, for helping me by sending me these questions here. All right. So Menachem, in today's context, environments, whether in the US or elsewhere, what lessons do you derive and what values do you live by as a second generation, and what can we do going forward?
Well, number one, to live by a value system, to live by it and not compromise, and teach certainly one's children, one's grandchildren, those values, which include being Jewish. And by being Jewish, it doesn't much matter whether you are an observant Jew, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular, cultural, but you have a heritage, you have a culture with values.
Mm-hmm.
Live it and transmit it. Secondly, understand that in the world, if we don't want others to be indifferent to anti-Semitism, and we don't want others to be indifferent to the Holocaust, we cannot be indifferent when others are the targets of hatred and when others are the targets of genocide, which doesn't mean that we don't have a primary obligation with respect to Holocaust remembrance. And of course, we have a primary responsibility to fight anti-Semitism, but it cannot be a mindset of that's all we care about. And if others are victims of bigotry and xenophobia, too bad, not our problem. It is our problem because we're all interrelated.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now, I know that you were involved with the International Network of Jewish Children of Holocaust Survivors. Can you tell us about some of the political activities you initiated there?
Well, we had any number. We had, I think, the first citywide demonstration event on behalf of Ethiopian Jewry in New York that we organized. On a somewhat larger scale, we led a demonstration protesting against President Reagan and Chancellor Kohl going to Bergen-Belsen on their way to the Bitburg Cemetery in 1985, where members of the Waffen-SS were buried. We were involved with a number of instances of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. We were quite deeply involved in the fight, together with the World Jewish Congress, to expose former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim as a as a Nazi and a liar. And then, of course, there was no one avenue, so that for many of us, the way we went about things were cultural, Yiddish culture, Yiddish music. Others were expressed themselves through art, still others through poetry and literature. You have novelists like Zane Rosenbaum and Melvin Bouquet. So it's our goal was to provide a basis for children of survivors and now children and grandchildren of survivors to take our legacy and do something constructive with it. And for those of us like myself who have a more social action orientation, it's in that direction, but it can be in any number of ways.
Great. Now, speaking of your involvement, it's easy to see, I'm going to ask a question about your parents. It's easy to see where this came from. Tell us about your father coming to the US in 1948 to get the US government to open up immigration for the Jewish refugees, and also about your mother, who accompanied orphans to Palestine around the same time.
Well, actually, my father was here in 1945. He was brought here by the Joint Distribution Committee, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, to address the first United Jewish Appeal conference after the war in Atlantic City, and to report on the condition of the survivors. And that was in December 45, January 1946. And at that point, he was actually less forceful on the issue of getting the US to open its gates. That he left to others. His issue was, and what was the mantra almost of the survivors, to open the gates to Palestine, for the British to allow the survivors to get to Palestine. And that involved holding speeches here, and then going back, being interviewed by the Anglo-American Commission on Palestine. And
So
when asked—
social action, right?
Yeah, and when asked, well, and he said, we want to go to Palestine. We all want to go to Palestine. And when asked, what if you're not able to? My father's response was, and again, I'm quoting from a journalist who was there, then we will go back to Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, and you will bear the responsibility for it. In the meantime, my mother in 1946 escorted 1,000 Jewish children, orphans, to Palestine. They had gotten visas, entry permits to go into Palestine from the British government outside the quota, and they were brought there. And again, what my mother discovered was that there really was a disconnect between the children and what they had gone through, and the Jews living in Palestine who were going on with their own issues, which were serious, and their own lives, and were not all that sensitive to what these children had gone through. And remember, these were children as opposed to adults. They did not have a prior basis. And one of the things my mother did at the time, there were efforts made between the various Israeli or Zionist political parties to divide the children, to have some taken on this kibbutz, some taken on that kibbutz, and it became a kind of a lottery. And the children, especially there were about 100 and something children from Bergen-Belsen, who were absolutely petrified because they didn't have parents. All they had was their friends, and they were about to be ripped apart. So my mother insisted and prevailed that the children were in fact divided among 3 kibbutzim so that they could remain together, and and they could retain their core of friends with whom they had been together for the past year and a half, some even in the camps, and not lose their support system.
Right. Okay. This is a question from Abe. He's wondering about the name of the town that your mother was from. So if you could just say it again, so
Well, my
connect
my
later.
mother, I mean, the Polish name was Sosnowiec. It's Yiddish was Sosnowiec, and
Oh, Sosnowiec, okay.
Which also became the German name of it because it was in a part of Poland that was actually annexed by the Third Reich. So it was, it became for some years a German town.
Okay, so Abe, in answer to your question, no, it's not the same town as your mother. You know, Menachem, I'm just realizing we didn't touch on your teaching at the law schools at both Columbia and Cornell Universities. You teach the law of genocide.
Correct. It's, look, it places what has happened since 1945 in context. On the one hand, efforts to prevent Holocaust genocide from happening again, which first manifests itself in the Nuremberg trials and other trials, and the adoption of the Genocide Convention, and then attempts to deal with the problem in the subsequent decades. And the Genocide Convention itself, its purpose is to prevent and punish genocides. Well, as an international society, we've done an adequate job, BB plus, let's say, on punishment. We know how to do that. We know how to put people on trial. As I said before, we have failed abysmally in preventing.
Right.
And I think it's important for young lawyers who are getting involved in international public law and in human rights law to be grounded in the history of how we got there. None of this, you know, we sort of take for granted. We have a genocide convention, we have a Declaration of Human Rights, we have all of that. Question is, what do we do with it and how did we get here?
Is teaching about the Nazi Holocaust, is that a big part of the classes?
Well, it is because it's where the law of genocide and the subsequent law originated. That's where it was rooted. I mean, bear in mind, the Nazis, the Germans did not invent the concept. There had been genocides, there had been slaughters of national, ethnic, religious groups going back to the beginning of history, including the Armenians at the beginning of the 20th century, including Native Americans at the hands of the US government in the 19th century in what became known as the Cherokee Trail of Tears. But it came, the perfect storm and the vastness represented by the Holocaust was a focal point that led the international legal community to start trying to do something about it, which had never happened before. Hence, you got crimes against humanity for the first time as a criminal cause of action at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. But so yes, that is an important part of the course, but we also go beyond to, as I said, Srebrenica and Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, what is happening today with the Rohingyas. And also, by the way, a realization that rape and sexual violence has now become an active tool in the perpetration of genocide. And it is becoming a ever more important part of the curriculum in this respect.
Right. I'm just mindful of the time. I know that you wanted to include, which I think would be a good time, the poem that you wrote about the second generation.
Well, it's a poem called Night Fragments. and it perhaps expresses where we are in the context of past and future. Night fragments created in fire shadows. We are the last and the first, the last to taste ashes from the cursed centuries valley of unwilling passers through, where God revealed his face to them alone. And the first, transfixed by still burning yesterdays, to reach beyond heaven and its clouds, beyond crimson ghost illusions, into ourselves, imploding in search of memory.
Yeah. Right. And, you know, for you, a political activist, a lawyer, it's almost incongruous to think of you as a poet, but your poems really speak very emotionally and speak to the point very well. I have the book and I enjoyed it.
Thank
So
you,
just
Ellen. Thank you.
in wrapping up now, unfortunately, there's some really great questions. We didn't have time. We have a copy of the chat. We will reach out. I will reach out if I can answer any of them and answer your questions. I believe the information about the group that Eva and I co-founded, Descendants of Holocaust Survivor, is in there. Please join us on Facebook. Please come to our events. And Josh, the museum, thank you again. Really
Thank you, Ellen and Menachem. Thank you for leading us in such a terrific and meaningful conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Inspirational. Survivors and their descendants are the bedrock of our community at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and you've helped us understand the second generation more deeply this evening. We've recorded this evening's program, and we'll email the recording to everyone in attendance, along with some suggested follow-up resources, including a link to Menachem's book of poetry. Stay posted for that email in your inbox. And if you find our programs interesting, we hope that you'll support the Museum of Jewish Heritage via the link in the Zoom chat, which I may have not put up, but that's okay. You can find us, and we'll also be adding you all to our mailing list if you're not already on it. Everything we do is made possible by the generosity of our community members. And if you're 2G or 3G or 4G in attendance this evening, you can get involved in Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, the organization that Ellen and Eva Fogelman founded. And so thank you once again. Have a great evening, everyone.